Waging war on corruption. It's Alex Jones coming to you live from the front lines of the info war.
Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, your host on this Friday, July 10th, 2015. One of the articles that I came across today that really disturbed me was this story of a SWAT raid. This is in St. Louis. They raided the wrong home. They break the windows. Then they issue a family a citation for the broken windows. Listen to how this breaks down. The family sitting down for dinner. If you've ever seen, again, when I read this, it was just like straight out of the movie Brazil by Terry Gilliam. Kind of a cross between 1984 and Monty Python's Flying Circus. He's one of the guys that was involved in it, the American. He directed that film. Again, this is the kind of dystopia that we live in, the kind of dysfunctional dystopia that we live in. They point out the family sitting down to dinner. All of a sudden, flash grenades bang through the house. Everything starts to explode. The front doors kick down. Armed assailants rush in. AR-15 rifles drawn and pointed at Walker and his family. These armed and incredibly incompetent, dangerous assailants, according to Free Thought Project, were members of the St. Louis Police Department SWAT team. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. They're at the wrong house. They realize they're at the wrong house. But for 2 hours, they go over everything in the house, even though this isn't the house of somebody who is dealing drugs. And listen, to all the conservatives out there, just understand that this violent intrusion is an enforcement of a UN agenda. You think they're not going to get violent with UN Agenda 21? You need to understand that the drug war that Richard Nixon declared was 10 years after the UN created its drug prohibition agenda, even having the 4 schedules of drugs there. It was verbatim an enactment of the UN agenda, just like we see done with the UN Agenda 21. The UN comes up with an agenda for getting everybody out of their private property, forced into the cities, and then they leave it up to the individual localities to enforce that. That's precisely what they did with the drug war. But nevertheless, these people had nothing to do with that. They're totally innocent of any of that. So they stayed there for 2 hours. They said they knew they were at the wrong address. Nevertheless, they tore the house apart in search of a non-existent reason to justify what they had done. And they point out, of course, that if he had been surprised and tried to defend himself, as we've seen many people do when your house is invaded by armed people, your instinct is to defend yourself. You get killed and you wind up a statistic, and it would have been on the nightly news that he was shot while he was trying to kill the police. Forget the fact that they initiated. Nevertheless, this is what they did. They couldn't find anything, so they called a building inspector. They couldn't find anything illegal that they could hang on these people to justify their raid, so they called a building inspector. 2 hours later, he goes around and he sees broken windows, which the SWAT team broke. And then he gives them a citation for the broken windows. The SWAT team did. Okay. This is the absurdity straight out of Brazil. Like I said, is it Buttle? Is it Tuttle? Who cares? We don't make mistakes. We just go ahead and, if you haven't seen that movie, you need to see it. It's one of my all-time favorite movies. I watch it at least once a year. Anyway, this is what happened. And this is not the first time this has happened. In St. Louis, they did the same thing, raiding the wrong house. They had a military-style raid. The house was destroyed. Their dog was killed. Their mother was kidnapped. And the reason was because they were behind on their gas bill. We've seen that happen before. A few years ago, the Department of Education did a armed SWAT team. This is when they were not nearly as common as they are now. An armed SWAT raid on a family where the mother was behind in her student loans. A year prior to this happening, the Washington Post had looked at the procurements by the Department of Education. Like, why are they buying militarized equipment? Why are they buying bulletproof vests and helmets and shotguns and all this stuff? Why are they arming? Why is the Department of Education arming itself? And then within a year, you see exactly why. Because it was their intention to go around and use SWAT raids to collect on student loans. And it was even worse after they drugged these people out, drugged the husband, drugged the kids out, face down, on the ground, in the middle of the night. They found out that the mom hadn't lived there for many years, who was behind on her school loans. Is that a reasonable way to come after people? Now, of course, like I said, the Washington Post realized that because they looked at the procurements. And we've talked about our government buying billions of rounds of ammunition, so much that they could fight something at the level of the Iraq War for many decades. And we questioned what's going on with that. And, of course, they would spin that, say, it's just for target practice. So we say, no, it's not for target practice. Not that quantity and not the kind of bullets. And just as I mentioned in the last segment, the U.S. Army, this is reported by USA Today, the U.S. Army is going to now buy hollow points for a new pistol that they have. Because, see, the Army didn't use hollow points. They were banned by the Hague Convention of 1899, and they point out, well, the U.S. didn't sign that. Nevertheless, they abided by that, did not use hollow point bullets in battle. No, hollow point bullets were reserved by the domestic police to be used against their own citizens in the individual countries. And, of course, they're a very expensive round. They're not something that you would use for target practice. They're something you use to control the population with a jackboot on their throat. This Washington Post article, 1 in 13 people killed by guns are killed by police. They say that's a rate of about 1 every 9 hours or 2.5 shootings per day. By comparison, cops in Germany killed only 8 people from 2013 to 2014, a 2-year period. British police didn't kill anyone last year. Okay? Another story from the Washington Post. Norwegian cops fired their guns twice last year. Didn't hit anyone either time. Yet, not in the U.S. The cops in the U.S. are responsible for 8% of the gun deaths. And then they go on to say, well, it's undoubtedly justifiable in many of these cases or in self-defense. It's like, I have to ask you this question then. Why is it that the other cops in other countries don't feel the need to kill people in self-defense? Why is it they don't feel that that's justifiable? It's because it's the way they're being trained now. The training is very different now for the police than it was not too long ago. Again, back in New Mexico, when there was the shootings, many of the shootings, it came to light that people in Albuquerque being shot at a higher rate even than in New York City. When you normalized it for the population, we had that shooting that went viral of the homeless man in the hills. So everybody started focusing on that, but they'd been under investigation for that prior to that. It was in the state, the New Mexico State Police Training Academy, that they put in what one of the long-term instructors called a shoot-first curriculum. This is something that's being driven from Washington. This is an agenda that's coming out of Washington, this militarization of the police. Just like they're putting the MRAPs and all these small-town police departments, they are training them to act this way, to shoot first, to come after civilians like this. That instructor who had worked there for many decades blew the whistle on it, and he refused to teach that curriculum, and he resigned. But now the people who have taken his place, they're going to teach that curriculum because that's the way it is working in the United States. And, of course, that is part of the control that is coming down, the iron fist that is going to enforce the law as we are staring at economic collapse. And, again, what's going on in China? We've had this massive movement this week with China and with Greece. Here's something that puts it in perspective. This is from Market Watch. They say China's stock market crash is just the beginning. They say the Chi-Next index, which is one of their stock market index, lost 42% of its value over the last 21 days. It wasn't just this crash at the beginning of this week. They say investors and traders who piled into Chinese shares over the past year caused the Shanghai to rise 150%, other markets to catapult even more dramatically. Then they faced margin calls because they were highly leveraged, just like 1929. Remember the feeding frenzy in 1929? Everybody was buying everything on margin, and people were saying, hey, you know, the shoeshine boy just went down and bought stocks. That is what has fueled what's going on in China. And, of course, this is something that is tied to the derivatives market, which was what caused the 2008 collapse, which was put onto the various countries like Greece that made their sovereign debt so unsustainable. Like, it's all connected. It's all related, and the chickens are coming home to roost. They say Shanghai opened up strongly at 8.5% by Monday, despite Greece's no vote. They said, but then shares slipped throughout the trading day and closed up only 2.5%. That was a clear sign that the government had taken its best shot and failed. And they point out, secular bear markets feature sudden, violent rallies, and then many bull markets will come in that will fool people into thinking that they're the genuine article, that it's all over with. It's also called a dead cat bounce. And that may be what we're seeing with some of these small movements here. They say the Great Recession and a domestic real estate bust are the fundamentals behind what's going on in China. And I remember at the end of the year, I had an interview with Gerald Celente. And he sat there with a paper out of China, and he said, look at this. This is a massive real estate bubble. They understand what's going on in China. They're very alarmed about it in the Chinese press, but he goes, you don't see anything about it in the New York Times. You don't see anything about it in the Wall Street Journal. You don't see anything about it in any of the U.S. papers. And he said, this is going to come home to roost, and we're starting to see that. That's why many people don't believe that this was this crash was something that is just temporary. They've also pointed out that this was equivalent to losing the entire economy of India. This wipeout that came out, the amount of equity that was lost was equivalent to the entire economy of India. Absolutely amazing. They say China has lost the equivalent of 15 Greeces in their market capitalization just in 3 weeks. In other words, the value of the stock market in China has gone down 15 times the size of the entire Greece economy. This is also another article up on Infowars.com, why China has no choice but to arrest the sellers. They say after dozens of separate interventions, manipulations, central planning machinations over the last 3 weeks, China has resorted to threats, calling for the arrest of hostile short sellers. So the reason they went so Orwellian is because they have lost so much money. And there was that's a Zero Hedge article. There was one earlier in the week where they had some jokes of people showing pictures of a Chinese guy saying, I didn't swear, I didn't sell, I swear I didn't sell. So this is what they're going to do. They're going to start arresting people who sell their stocks, because that's the way the communists do things. Stay with us. We'll be right back with more economic news.